Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online Zoom event from the Foreign Correspondents Club with Maria Ressa and Caoilfhionn Gallagher. It's a conversation on what is next after the cyber libel verdict in the Philippines. So we're very honored to have with us Maria Ressa, the founder and CEO of Rappler, and Caoilfhionn Gallagher, who's a barrister specializing in human rights and civil liberties. And for the few who don't know, a judge in Manila on June 15th handed down a six-year jail sentences to Maria Ressa and Rappler's researcher Ronaldo Santos for cyber libel, provoking an international outcry over the implications for press freedom in the Philippines. These verdicts came just over a month after the government shut down the country's biggest broadcaster, ABS-CBN, in what was seen by a move by the government of President Duterte to stifle critical media coverage. Maria has vowed to fight her conviction all the way to the Supreme Court in her country in a case that has become a symbol of the global battle to preserve press freedom. Joel Simon, the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, who we had on just a few weeks ago, said at that event that if we cannot keep Maria Ressa out of prison, then every tyrant and every repressive government, will feel that they can act against journalists without consequence. So tonight we are lucky to have Maria with us. She is the CEO and executive editor of Rappler. She's been honored around the world for her fight in fighting disinformation, fake news, and attempts to silence the free press. In 2018, she was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, along with some others, and won the prestigious Golden Pen of Freedom Award from the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. She's been a journalist in Asia for more than 30 years, and I might note, a friend to the FCC when we have needed one. Caoilfhionn Gallagher leads the international counsel team for Maria with Amal Clooney. She has acted in many landmark human rights cases in the UK before the European Court of Human Rights and UN bodies, and has particular expertise in media defense work, acting for journalists, bloggers, and media organizations at risk due to their work. She is a Queen's Counsel and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Moderating tonight's conversation will be Eric Wishart, who's our first vice president at the FCC and with the AFP, and has known Maria for a while and has been in conversation with her a number of times. Tonight is more important really than really any of those other times, and we're very honored that we can have both these guests and that you're all joining us. We welcome questions. Please send them through the chat, and we will attempt to get them answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy, for the introduction, and welcome. Maria, I would like to start by asking you, how have you been since the judgment? How do you, what does it feel like? Because that day finally came. I mean, we talked about it a long time, and then the verdict came down. So how have you been? And have you been in contact with Ronaldo Santos, and how's he doing?
Well, so there's so much that has happened since June 15th, Eric, and like right now, even as we speak, there's a House hearing going on. And on Twitter, you see hashtag vote yes to ABS-CBN franchise. That's #1 in the Philippines, and it's trending also globally. That refers to the hearing for the franchise of ABS-CBN. It was shut down. Very much like Rappler, a small regulatory agency gave it a note to shut down on May 5th. They shut down, and now they're fighting for their lives in Congress. There will be a vote tomorrow. Oh my gosh, how do I feel? Death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, was it a surprise, Eric? No, not if you pull out. Did I hope that it would be better? Yes, but I feel like it's not just us on trial. When the verdict happened, I looked at Ray's eyes when we came out, and we really scanned the verdict afterwards. And I could see, what does this mean for us? We're still grappling with that, but at the same time, we're fighting for our democracy. It is death by 1,000 cuts, right? Literally. And emotionally, I feel like I'm geared up for battle. It's been 4 years, and we continue to fight impunity of the Duterte administration, not just now in the drug war, but also to demand rule of law, to demand our rights. And then impunity, and this you've heard me talk about forever as well, Eric, impunity of the platforms, the tech platforms that have enabled these types of attacks.
And how's the staff? Because I wouldn't name names, but I was in contact with some of them the day of the verdict, and they were crying. You know, it was very emotional. I mean, so how's the Rappler staff holding up in this situation?
You know, forged in fire. I mean, of course, we're not automatons, and there'll be highs and lows. And I think the best description I've gotten of what we've been going through, imagine 4 years of this, right? The best description is kind of like, it's fitting for the times, like getting a virus, like getting sick, and then, you know, not really being able to shake it off completely. There are days you wake up and you're feeling okay. And then there are days you wake up and, like yesterday, I woke up and late night, President Duterte gave a statement at 1 a.m. and he called me a fraud, right? And kind of, he said he wasn't threatening, but he did threaten. He said, you know, there's more coming, essentially. But anyway, so we got through it. And I think—
Maria, what did he, I read that. What was he getting at? I mean, what was he trying to say? What's coming? I didn't quite understand. It was a bit vague. What was your understanding of it?
I think it was vague. I think it was just, you know, the same sort of Damocles, the Damocles sword hanging over your head. And it's different when the president of the country does that. He did that to us in 2017, in July of 2017. So, you know, the exponential attacks on social media, those same attacks came from President Duterte in July of 2017 in his State of the Nation address, which is coming up soon again, right? It's going to be the end of his 4th year. Well, as soon as he attacked us, a week later, we got our first subpoena. And that opened us in 2018 to 11 cases and investigations by the Philippine government. And then, you know, so on and so forth. What he said 2 nights ago, I mean, it's hard to fathom. And when I was asked for statements about it, he talked about fraud. And so, you know, he talked about how I was a fraud. How do you respond to that? You really don't. I cheekily responded on Twitter by saying that perhaps President Duterte is seeing too much fraud around him. I don't know how to respond. I've never been in this situation. And next year will be my 35th year as a journalist. So I just, you know, I tried very hard to be respectful of the post, even though I'm personally attacked for just doing my job. And so far, all of the attacks have not really shown any evidence. And so this is also part of the reason I pull in the platforms, because when you repeat something over and over and over again, it becomes a fact in our information ecosystem today. And I think that the social media platform should be giving extra protection for journalists who are under attack.
Have you met President Duterte?
Absolutely. I've known him since the 80s, right? When I hadn't seen him in a long time, but when he decided that, shortly before he decided to run for office, I interviewed him in Davao City in October of 2015. And when we saw each other, he remembered. I mean, for a long time, I was the face of CNN in the Philippines and in the countries I covered. So he talked about the story we did in the late 80s in Davao, and you know, similar issues of the same types of issues. And then I interviewed him again in December of 2016, after he was already president. And, you know, I was actually fascinated by his style of leadership. You know this, Eric. Like, I think that a leader's vision, a leader's ideas will determine the kind of organization he runs. And President Duterte, in December of 2016, I asked him again whether violence and fear were part of the way he wants to lead. And he said, absolutely. And that's kind of the atmosphere that we live in.
And I mean, if he's talking about you said it was, you know, late in the day. I mean, why do you think Rappler gets so under his skin?
I don't think it's just Rappler, but I do think that we continue doing our jobs. I mean, you asked how Rappler's doing. We're doing our work. we're going to be rolling out a new tech platform. So we're not just doing our journalism, we're also doing the innovation that needs to happen at this point in time. That will roll out site-wide next week, right? So Rappler is looking at this as every crisis is an opportunity. And I guess that's the upside of trying to look at very bad things going on around you. One of the things we know for sure is that these are not normal times. The world has crumbled. We're standing on the rubble. COVID-19 brings it up all the time. And this is, in Manila, it is the 16th week of a lockdown, modified for different places. So when we come out, it's a different world. And I guess we know that. But we also know that what's really critical here, in the absence of any discussion of values, ethics, principles, that's critical. And that's what we always want to bring it to.
And just before I move to you, Caoilfhionn, we have a question from Neil Carabine. Maria, are you allowed to leave the Philippines, or are you?
I should be, because I have 8 criminal charges against me. So I've been issued 8 arrest warrants in 2019, and I'm out on bail on all of those. I pay bonds as well. I use this all the time because Rappler as a whole has paid more than 4 million pesos. So 1 million pesos is about $20,000. So we paid 4 million pesos in bail and bonds alone. So I should be allowed to travel. Nothing should have changed.
Even with the conviction?
Even with the conviction. The judge did say, but we'll see. We'll see as time goes on. Again, it's a constitutional right. At least that's what my lawyers tell me. Right. Having said that, these are different times, and I think that's part of it. Eric, the president signed an anti-terror law that is very similar to what you guys are going through in Hong Kong. Similar, because China is such a big force in both of our countries right now. But in our case, this anti-terror law that was just signed has already gotten several petitions at the Supreme Court. It essentially would allow a small group of cabinet secretaries to designate anyone, a critic, a dissident, a terrorist. And when they do that, they can arrest that person without a warrant and hold that person in jail for up to 24 days.
Caoilfhionn, moving across the planet to London, I think, right?
Yes.
Yes, so can you please tell us, explain your role as a human rights lawyer? You're in the same chambers with Amal Clooney. How did you both discover Maria's case, and what does this international defense team actually mean in practical terms? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric. So what's happening to Maria is not only deeply concerning as a matter of Philippines law, and in our view, clearly violative of basic provisions in domestic law. The Philippines has a long history and a proud history of protecting press freedom since the 1930s. It's also gravely concerning as a matter of international law. So as international human rights lawyers, we do a number of things. We consider legal avenues to vindicate Maria's rights on the international plane. We work closely with the legal team domestically in the Philippines on international human rights law within the Philippines. And we work in other ways to protect Maria's rights. And that's something that's very familiar to our council team. There's 4 of us. There's myself and Amal Clooney lead it. And we work with 2 brilliantly talented other international counsel, Jan Yaginsu and Claire Overman. And the 4 of us together work on this case. And we also work with the benefit of support from Covington and Burling in the United States, because of course Maria is also a dual national, a US national, and there's particular issues arising in relation to the US. So in terms of the background, I should just, yeah. Sorry?
You said particular issues. Which issues?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, obviously what you've got here in relation to Maria is you've got a situation where she's been targeted by Duterte's administration simply for doing her job, simply for being a journalist. And the background to it is, of course, her hard-hitting stories about Duterte's war on drugs, police brutality and corruption have resulted in her being in Duterte's sights. And what you now have is the government responding to this single reporter and to Rappler, her organisation, with the full might of the state. And just to put in context, her conviction on the 15th was in one of a large number of cases against Maria, and she received a sentence in that case of up to 6 years imprisonment for, if I can put it this way, a article which was not written by her, wasn't an article that she wrote, was written under a draconian law, she was prosecuted under a draconian law which didn't even exist at the time that the article was published, and she's been convicted on that basis and sentenced to a custodial sentence in a clear violation of international law. And the background is that this is one of a number of cases, and Maria faces up to a century in prison in the event that she's found guilty on this range of other charges. And can I say one thing, Eric, just arising from a question you put to Maria earlier in relation to the late night Duterte comment in the early hours of yesterday morning. And you both used the phrase that it's a bit vague, and Maria mentioned sort of Damocles. And it's quite right that that kind of threat is obviously intended to have a chilling effect on Maria. It's meant to send a clear message to Maria that she's being watched, that action will be taken against her. But it's also supposed to send a clear message to other independent voices, to other journalists, to civil society in the Philippines to be gagged. And critically, although that was a vague threat yesterday, the context is that Duterte for many years has been openly contemptuous of journalists. His former campaign spokesperson called journalists prostitutes, and he said a number of years ago, just because you're a journalist, you're not exempted from assassination if you're a son of a bitch. So the wording was vague yesterday, but the context could not be clearer. And of course, we also have in the backdrop ABS-CBN going dark, something which people thought was something which people thought was unheard of very, very recently. So that's the context in which you've got to look at those words.
Just one thing. I mean, the article was originally published before the law, but it was republished. I mean, their argument is that it was republished because of they corrected a typo. But I mean, in Britain, if you republished an article, you're repeating the libel. So why would that not apply in this case? If wouldn't then just the sheer fact of republishing it, even under the explanation that you're correcting a typo, you are republishing it in a new legal framework. So why would that stand as an argument?
So the correction is a correction of a single letter. So the word evasion was misspelt to be spelled EVATION, and it was corrected to an S, not by Maria and not by Ray. So that's what it is. You're dealing with a single letter being corrected. Now, in fact, in a very detailed 130-page submission, which has gone into the trial judge last week, we've set out very clearly with the domestic team why the trial judge has not, in fact, made a proper finding that this was republication. But in any event, it doesn't get around the fact that this was not a republication by Maria. And critically, it doesn't get around the fact that this was a piece of public interest journalism, and it has resulted in a criminal sentence, and it has resulted in a custodial sentence of up to 6 years, which is in clear violation of international standards, which the Philippines has ratified.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the public interest, because I had an exchange with Joel Simon, who is the executive, for those of you who are not familiar with him, who's a great champion of press freedom around the world. He's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and as Jody said in the introduction, spoke on a call a couple of weeks ago about the situation in the United States. And I told him I was talking to both of you. So he sent a question, actually. He said, it'd be great if I could ask them about the public interest and the failure of the judge to consider that the article was about the conduct of a public official and was not some salacious report about a private figure. I mean, the two people spoken about in that article were the former Chief Justice, I think, of the Supreme Court, Renato Corona, and Wilfredo King, who's a businessman, but I think you argue is a public counts as a public figure. So Joel said, I know that Maria and her defense team are keen to make this argument to the media. So could you please explain, I mean, Joel wrote a whole article about the fact that, you know, there's a big difference between libeling a private individual and writing about public figures and divulging information that's in the public interest. So, but that doesn't seem to have been accepted as an argument in the case. So I'll leave you to decide who answers that one, but Joel Simon asked.
Yeah, in fact, if I hadn't known who asked you the question, Eric, I would have said there's a superb article in the Columbia Journalism Review, dated 30th of June, by Joel Simon, because it's a really brilliant piece. And if people haven't seen it, and in fact, I'll post it in the chat, they should take a look at it. And it's Joel's very close analysis of the 37-page judgment from the trial judge. But I suggest on the substantive point, why doesn't Maria go first, and I'll come in afterwards.
Maria?
I just sent you the link on the private, this has been used by I thought it interesting. Our palace spokesman was essentially saying the same thing, the private individual. There's a link of a story that was done on Rappler, I guess a year ago or 2 years ago. In terms of the public interest, we made that case again in our motion for partial reconsideration. This is now back with the judge at the RTC branch. Look, there had to be legal acrobatics to bring this case to court and to convict me and Ray. And when you pull out and look at the big picture, actions speak louder than words.
Jalen?
Yeah, and I agree with what Maria said, and I very much endorse and support Joel Simon's brilliant article on this issue. And in terms of domestic law, the key issue is that the court here treated Kang as a private individual and applied the test of this being a private individual case. And there's a public figure exception to libel found in Article 354 of the revised penal code. And had that been applied, the prosecution would have been required to prove malice, actual malice, which the prosecution failed to do here. And it's clear that the target of this piece, not written by Maria, written many years previously, was the judge and an allegation of judicial corruption, which linked to Kang. And in fact, that judge was obviously subsequently removed from office. I mean, it's hard to think of a more public interest type story than a story such as that, relating to corruption at the highest level within the state. And that's what the article was. And it's a gross mischaracterization in the trial judge's judgment at first instance to describe this as not even being an issue concerning press freedom, as she does repeatedly. And it is wrong as a matter of law domestically for her to have failed to apply the public interest exception to libel, found in Article 354, but also under international standards, as Joel's piece makes very clear. Public interest journalism has particular protection. And when it comes to justifying even libelous statements, which are not true within public interest journalism, there's a particularly exacting standard required of the court, which simply wasn't met here. And I commend to you Joel's piece. I should say just one other quick point, which I didn't make earlier on the republication, Eric. And that is, it sounds like a boring technical point, but it's really critical, that even in the event that the trial judge was right, that the correction of the T to the S constituted a republication, which we say it was not. That happened in 2014. And Maria was not charged until January 2019. And there's a 1-year limitation period under this law. So it's illegal in any event. It doesn't get them home. And we've dealt with that in this very long submission that we've put into the trial judge, asking her to reconsider her decision. Can
you go into that in a bit of detail, please? Because that's your first sort of appeal, isn't it? You know, in a layperson's terms. Right.
Yeah.
But you're appealing to the judge who made the decision to reverse her decision. So, but can you explain?
Yes, of course. I mean, it may sound surprising, but it's a particular mechanism which is open in Philippines law. So when Maria and Ray were convicted and sentenced on the 15th of June, Monday, 15th of June, that awful day, there then was a 15-day period within which Maria could file an appeal to the Court of Appeals. And there's two stages of appeal in the Philippines. There's the Court of Appeal, and then the next level up is the Supreme Court, if you have to go that far. But there's an option before that, which gives you an extra bite at the cherry. So it gives you 3 bites at the cherry rather than 2, which you would normally have. And that is going back to the trial judge to ask the trial judge to reconsider any of her decisions. Now, it's a motion for partial reconsideration that's gone in. It went in 14 days later on the 29th, last Monday. And it's partial because, of course, the judge found that Rappler didn't have liability, so she's not being asked to reconsider that. And the judge is now considering on the papers our application. So it's over 130 pages. I think you'll all be pleased to hear. I'm not going to run through the key points, but it sets out 13 key fundamental flaws in her reasoning, showing that she made basic errors of facts and law, and she wrongly summarized the evidence, and also the trial judge violated Maria's rights in rendering the judgment. And there's really 13 key points which we make there, but the central ones for today's purposes, I think, given who we've got on the call, are this issue about this being a retroactive application of a law which wasn't in place at the time, this being a public interest piece of journalism, and the error under domestic and international law in not recognizing this was a public interest piece of journalism, and critically, the fact that the conviction in this case and the sentence violate both Philippines standards under the Constitution and clear case law from the Philippines Supreme Court and international standards. And on that point, there's a case called Adonis and the Philippines, which was decided a number of years ago against the Philippines in the Human Rights Committee of the UN. And the United Nations Human Rights Committee found that this particular law violated international standards. It violates Article 19 of the ICCPR, and the Philippines was required to decriminalize libel and to cease imprisoning people for allegedly libelous speech. So what we have here is a rerun of the law found wanting in the Adonis case. And David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, took the very unusual step of filing an amicus brief before the trial judge, not something he usually does, to highlight international standards. He emphasized that the Philippines is a party to the ICCPR, the International Covenant, having ratified it in 1986. It's binding, has the force of law, and he urged the Philippines to do the right thing. And regrettably, the trial judge did not do the right thing. And it's critical for all of us who are here today to make clear to the trial judge, and if we have to go that far, to the Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court, that the world is watching, and the world is holding them to that yardstick under international law. They signed up to it in 1986. They're obliged to comply with it. And it's outrageous what's happened on the 15th. And it's outrageous what Maria is going through.
I mean, does that answer the question that some people might ask is, you know, this is Philippines law. I mean, why should international lawyers, why should a QC in London have anything to say on something that comes under Philippines law? So if somebody says that in the Philippines, what's the answer to that? Why should Maria benefit from an international defense team?
Maria, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do that. Of course. Look, I have never seen the Philippines that I am living through right now. It surprises me what we've gone through to just do our jobs. I think having 8 arrest warrants issued against me and then Rappler, having to fight cases that are just ridiculous. I mean, and I have to worry about what I say now, right? Because all the cases are live. I spent 2019 in and out of every courtroom you can think of. I now know our justice system and the nature of how things move very, very well. Part of the reason that our international legal team is there is precisely because the best defense that we have had is to shine the light. It's what journalists do. We tell our stories. Well, lawyers tell better stories in terms of the law. They know the law in ways that we can't. And I think what I've realized is that while again, I hope that rule of law exists in the Philippines, I also would like to make sure that my rights are protected. And I've never had to take this step before. And I am very, very lucky to have fantastic lawyers come. I mean, Covington has come pro bono, you know, people who, like Keelan, oh my gosh, just being in the same room with Keelan, I learned law, you know, the way her mind works, trying to understand the connective tissue. Eric, you know, as we cover the breakdown of news organizations and the change of journalism, well, hand in hand with that goes the law. Because when we search for justice, justice is held by lawyers, and lawyers are going through just as much of a disruption as we are, as journalists are. And so working with Keelan and our international legal team shows me the connective tissue between what we're going through here in the Philippines and then what are the norms. What should the world be? But even then I find they find it difficult to actually, and I think this is the impact of technology, frankly, you know, rule of law globally is under threat. And so I learned from Keelan.
Keelan,
yeah.
for the other...
Oh, sorry, Eric. I was just going to say something quick on that question. So first of all, critically, the Philippine Supreme Court in a wide range of cases has relied on international law to inform its decision-making. That's the first point. The second point is that we've made very clear in the submission to the court and in the work that we're doing, this is also a violation of Philippines domestic law, without doubt. So, you know, I made reference, for example, to the use of a sentence violating international standards. It also quite clearly violates the Supreme Court circular in the Philippines. So this isn't a matter of international lawyers coming in and imposing some external view. But the third point is that the Filipino National Union of Journalists has described what Maria is facing as a barrage of lawsuits, revealing a shameless act of persecution by a bully government. And voices, many voices domestically within the Philippines are describing how what's happening is a misuse of the law, a weaponizing of the law within the Philippines in a way that is gross and inappropriate. And international standards make clear that cannot and should not happen. And these are flagrant breaches of Maria's rights, protected by international treaties, which the Philippines has ratified, and it is answerable on the international stage for those breaches.
Could you explain the role of a lawyer, an international lawyer? I mean, you're involved in the case of the family of Daphne Galizia, who was assassinated in Malta, BBC, Iranian journalists working for the BBC. I mean, what is the role? What is your role? The role with you and Amal Clooney? How does the synergy work with the local domestic laws?
Sure. It's a bit of an existential question in terms of what we do. So I suppose there's a few different things. So in some of the cases that we do, you are dealing with regimes which are simply not rule of law compliant, you know, and don't have functioning courts in any sensible way, and where the breaches are very flagrant. So, you know, a number of years ago, I was acting for a cartoonist who was detained in Equatorial Guinea in ways which were, so a political satirist, a cartoonist, who was detained in circumstances where there simply were no legal safeguards. We didn't have a way, there was no way of using a habeas corpus or an unlawful detention mechanism within domestic law to try to get him out. And in those circumstances, the law has to be used in a way which is quite political. You've got to look at, well, where do you have leverage with Equatorial Guinea? Is it through the United Nations? Is it through other states that have particularly close relationships with Equatorial Guinea? Is it through speaking to companies who invest in the country and saying, look, these are breaches of international laws. Do you really want to be associated with this? So it just depends on the situation. So the examples that you gave there, Daphne Caruana Galizia, I mean, that is a particularly shocking case in circumstances where it took place in a European country, a Council of Europe and a European Union country. Obviously, it was a brutal assassination of Daphne in a car bomb, and in many ways it was deeply shocking and resulted in Malta losing the voice of a journalist who's often referred to as Malta's conscience. But frankly, in many other ways, it was not shocking because it followed 3 decades of Daphne being harassed and abused and multiple attempts to silence her. And 10 days before her assassination, she spoke and gave an interview to the Council of Europe about her life and what it had become. And she described arson attacks on her home, attempts to cut off her income, the freezing of her bank accounts, dozens of libel suits brought by ministers and business people, and to my great shame, many of them threatened by law firms based here in London, vile misogynistic attacks online, critics on the street calling her a witch. And the phrase she used was, she said, "You get used to it like a scar forms round a wound." And I'm afraid those words are very much in my mind when I hear Maria talking about what she's going through. And one of the deep concerns in the Malta case is this was happening for a long time and it was known. And I'm afraid that countries that have close relationships with Malta, within the European Union and within the Council of Europe, did not speak out earlier. They spoke out afterwards, after her death, but they did not speak out before October 2017. And it's critical that that does not happen here. And it's why we're so grateful to, for example, the European Union External Action Service, who on the 15th, when Maria was sentenced, gave a hugely powerful statement immediately. A minister from the Netherlands, hugely powerful statement immediately. And we praise and applaud states who do that and who stand up to say this is unacceptable.
Maria, can you tell people the kind of online abuse that you face? I mean, I think you said it's actually got worse instead of better.
I think, you know, it's sometimes easier to talk about it at a macro scale. Every time I look at all of the stuff that I've gone through, it's dehumanizing. That's the end goal of this. And it's connected to hate, right? Part of the problem is that if you can get torn apart so that people do not see you as human, then you are a very easy target. So I think about it on a macro level as, you know, here's the influence operations that is manipulating what people think. Here's the lie that it goes into the social media system. It infects real people. The lie is, in 2016, journalist equals criminal. And you know, when I first saw that and I was described as a criminal, I laughed, and so did everyone else who knew me. In 2017, when President Duterte then says Rappler is a criminal, then it comes, you go bottom up, exponentially, you say the same thing over and over. By 2017, when President Duterte and officials tap down, people say, well, maybe there's something there. Where there's smoke, there's fire. It's called astroturfing, manufacturing consensus on social media. And then by 2017, 2018, 11 cases and investigations, 2019, 8 arrest warrants, 2020, a conviction. Journalist equals criminal. Those same messages keep getting repeated over and over. That's the easy one. The names are easy. It's the threats, death, rape, beheading, looting. I mean, our office has been doxxed. They've asked to do really horrendous things that have stayed on social media. I've been attacked as a woman, my facial features, because I'm brown, because I have eczema. I smile because that's the only reaction you can have. It's like going back to kindergarten and unleashing the worst, like people who should know better, but these are real people. So this is where I go to social media. Social media platforms are behavioral modification systems. And with the level of micro-targeting, anyone can actually target different parts of society and say different things, and no one would know, right? So one group thinks I'm an animal, another group thinks I'm an oligarch, another group thinks, and in the meantime, all I am is a journalist trying to do my job. When
you say influence operations, that means this is organized. It's not just random people that don't like you online. This is an influence operation implies there's a state behind it or an organization. So can you expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. I think the reason that we became a target was because in 2016, we not only challenged the drug war. In 2016, before the end of the year, if you remember, the numbers that were reported by the police themselves was 7,000 people killed, right? Now you're talking about tens of thousands. According to human rights groups, the Philippine police agree it's between 6,000 to 8,000 people killed. Regardless of the number, these are people killed without any due process, right? extrajudicial killings. Having said that, the other reason is because we exposed the propaganda machine. It was a 3-part series in October of 2016. We started working on this in August. Bits and pieces of it were coming out, but the full attack of that machine came on us in October because we published 3 parts: the weaponization of the internet, how Facebook algorithms impact democracy. These 2 pieces I wrote. And the third was manufactured consensus, how 26 fake accounts could influence up to 3 million others. As soon as all of those were published, we were clobbered. And that's how I know firsthand what can happen. It's strange, right? I feel privileged, if that's the right word. I'm the target of attacks. I'm analyzing the attacks. And I'm a journalist trying to report on a government. I'm running a business, right? So, and we're building tech. So all of those things made us realize how social media, when you say a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes a fact. The other part is when you beat someone, whether it's a person or a fracture line in society, repeatedly, it opens the fissure. I talked a little bit about, journalist equals criminal. Well, take it to the United States and look at what's in the Mueller report, which said that as in 2016, one of the first fissure lines, the target of Russian disinformation was Black Lives Matter. Then you think through what 4 years have done, because again, influence operations, real people, changes their minds, changes their actions. Fast forward 4 years, and we see the impact on society. I think this is, if COVID-19 hadn't happened, I thought 2020 was going to be the year of reckoning for technology and how it has destroyed democracy and the kind of dystopian present it has created.
Eric, just on that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just something quick, just on the attacks. There's 3 quick points I just wanted to come in on after what Maria said. The first is that undoubtedly there's been a spike in the online attacks that Maria's been receiving, and not just online on social media, but also through email and other ways. So the ways in which she's feeling the world is closing in on her with those attacks, there's certainly been a spike since the 15th, since the conviction and sentence. Secondly, the nature of them, many of them, a very high volume of them, are particularly gendered and misogynistic, and they are focused on trying to dehumanize Maria and to give the message that she's fair game for attack. And you mentioned earlier BBC Persian, and that's something I see with many of the women journalists at BBC Persian, for example. Many of the attacks against them are quite focused on their gender. They suggest that they're sexually promiscuous, fake pornography, which circulates with their head doctored and added to images, for example. And there's obviously a trend, many in your audience will know that there's a general trend of women journalists being more targeted online, and that happens in all countries, but this is a particularly extreme version of that trend. And the third point, Eric, is on your question about this being organized. It's quite right that we think that this is organized and sophisticated. These aren't random voices. Now, some of that we think is quite direct, and there's ways in which we can trace back many of those attacks to particular plans. But also some of it is indirect. And when you have the leader of a country early in the morning yesterday making that statement describing Maria as a fraud, that, it seems to us, is a way of saying there's a culture of impunity, Maria's fair game, do what you want. And unfortunately, that trend is not restricted to dictatorships or countries where there's a problem with the rule of law. I mean, anyone who's on the call from the US will, of course, know about Trump's description of journalists as the enemies of the people. And unfortunately, we have seen a kind of an attack in many countries, including democracies, on journalists and on their work, and that has a resulting impact on their safety, their liberty, and often their lives. And that's a trend which is not confined to states which are autocratic or dictatorships. Unfortunately, that's a more general trend.
Maria, I mean, there was that amazing year you traveled. I actually even saw you in Glasgow, my hometown, at the World Association of Newspapers.
Breakfast. I remember. We had a meal. Yeah.
And then you were in New York for the big crystal ball in Times Square. Is that crystal ball, Jody? No. It looks crystal, you know, with wherever the ball they drop, you know. Okay, what I know about Times Square New Year's Eve, and then you were on the front cover with of Time magazine, amongst other journalists who were honoured as the Persons of the Year. How important was that exposure in? Does it help? Does it protect journalists? I mean, not just you. I mean, internationally, how does, you talk about shining the light, how important is that kind of international recognition and support?
I think it's extremely important. You know, when you're living in uncertain times, and I think you would know this as well, right? When old rules are gone, and even though there is a constitution where I am, but it's unclear, and these kinds of ad hoc violations and abuses of power happen. You just don't want to be the one targeted. Well, when it happened to me, the first thing, of course, is you try to kind of lay low, right? You kind of try to just do your jobs. Journalists aren't great about talking about themselves. I would say part of the reason I talk a lot right now is because I was arrested unjustly. I was detained when I should have been released on bail, and I saw the abuse of power firsthand. So when Time Magazine happened, I found out about it on Twitter. Time didn't actually tell me. And when I saw it, it was dinner time here in Manila, and I looked at it and I thought it was, I actually sent it to our social media team because I thought that it wasn't real. And then when I got the call, this was, CNN was the first one, I guess because they had my number, they called me, and I was like, the first thing that happened was my stomach sank, because I thought, oh my gosh, this will mean I will be targeted even more. And only later did I realize that the only defense you have when you are under attack is to speak, to tell people what is happening, and that actually created a little bit of a shield around us, and allowed us to keep doing our jobs. Because in the end, that's the end goal. Because all of this, the full force of government, who wants to fight a government? I never set out to do that. You know, that full force is there to prevent us from doing our jobs. First, to scare you mentally. The first battle is in your head. And then the second battle is this, right? You know, who would have thought I would have 8 arrest warrants? I still sometimes don't believe it, but you know, this is the world I live in now. So I think we need, I guess, a last point here, and Keelan will have great points. More than ever, journalism is under attack in a way that I have never seen, and I've been around a long time, and I think the only way we will survive this is if we collaborate. That's the first step. The second is to actually understand the technology, and then the third is to demand our rights. Because if we don't use our rights, we will lose them.
I've got a question from Forecast News for Maria. Have you been requesting the social media community to help in your battle against social media bots? And it goes on, how do forms of harassment such as these reflect the current state of press freedom in the Philippines? And should journalists around the world feel threatened by what we see happening to you? So,
yes, the first one, yes, absolutely. Because I think, you know, I said this in December of 2016. I was in the United States, and I said that what's happening to us is coming soon to you. That was December of 2016. And, you know, I've written, I'll share a link with you in the LA Times during Press Freedom Week there, where I said that our dystopian present is America's dystopian future. It's not just America, it's every democracy around the world, precisely because for the very, very first time in human history, social media platforms connect us. If you take all of Facebook's properties, it's like more than 3 billion different accounts all around the world. So a lie in Hong Kong comes to Manila instantaneously, comes to New York instantaneously. These influence operations that we know have worked and continue to work are having an impact on real people. You talked about bots. In the States, that could be. In Western countries, yes, maybe bots can do it, but in the Philippines, and Facebook has said this in a lot of their disclosures, the Philippines has higher than normal number average of fake accounts. Fake accounts, real people hiding behind anonymous. So when you talk about, Facebook uses the phrase coordinated inauthentic behavior. That's another way of saying influence operations, right? CIB. Well, yeah, at the beginning, they'll pound you and you'll know that this is kind of fake. That would have been like 4 years ago. But fast forward 4 years, and many people now, I've never seen so many people doubt journalists in the way they do today because of the platform. The world's largest distributor of news is Facebook, right? So these are things. The last part I'd say is that polarity, the division of our society, is built into the design of all social media platforms. If you think about it like this is what we lived through in the Philippines. At the beginning, we all believed in the same facts. And then in 2016, I began to see the weaponization of social media. The same campaign accounts that helped President Duterte get elected when the drug war began were weaponized. And here we were, what we saw is, let's just say pro-Duterte, anti-Duterte. You can say pro-security, anti-security law, whatever you want. We're here in the center. We all believe in the same facts. Well, then those who, the information operations or the influence operations then began to move the pro-Duterte guys because they were only talking amongst themselves. That's the growth of algorithms is it gives you friends of friends, right? So as your friends of friends grow, you begin to lose sight of the other side. So you move further to the right. If pro-Duterte, if you are anti-Duterte, you're surrounding yourselves with people like you, so you move further away. And you move further away. And you move further away. In the meantime, here is the public sphere. No one can agree on what the facts are. And that's part of the death by 1,000 cuts of our democracy. It's built into the design.
Caoilfhionn, what do you think of the role of social networks in all of this?
Yeah, so I agree with Maria, obviously. I suppose just a couple of quick additional points. I think one of the very frustrating things here is that in many ways social media has been core to Rappler's successful model, but we've then seen social media turned against Maria with the weaponization of social media in a way that furthers and enhances the attacks against her, which is deeply concerning. And that of course becomes much more problematic as we proceed. So on BBC Persian, one of the things that we deal with is coordinated online attacks from both sides. You know, so some people saying Ayatollah BBC, suggesting that BBC Persian is in league with the government, and then a whole range of other people who claim the opposite. We see that with Maria too, so you see a range of different ways in which people speak out. But I suppose for me, the quick additional point as the boring legal point that I just wanted to add in is, as well as the weaponization of social media, one of the trends that we've seen recently that overlaps is the weaponization of particular legal mechanisms. And something which we see very broadly is the weaponization, for example, of fake news laws. And there being good reason to bring in regulation in respect of fake news. We then see it being turned into something which is used against journalism and as a silencing tool for public interest journalism, and similarly with counterterrorism laws. And there's so many examples of that. I've got clients in Egypt who are falling foul of that at the moment, where if you publish anything, you're accused of being in league with the Muslim Brotherhood, you're being accused of publishing fake news. So counterterrorism laws and fake news laws are increasingly being used as other mechanisms. So there's a weaponization of legal mechanisms against journalists and against public interest and investigative journalism.
Do you think it's accelerated with COVID-19?
Yes, certainly. And actually, I can post some links in the chat to some work that I've done on COVID-19 being used as an excuse for cracking down on journalists. And one of the difficulties that I've had in the last number of weeks for my clients has been, in some cases, you have new emergency laws rushed in, which are then used. There's many examples, and I see some of the attendees here will know about this. There's many examples, for example, of states attempting to use emergency laws under COVID-19 on a grand scale, reputation management. So gagging doctors from speaking out about failures in systems and lack of PPE and so on. But the other real issue is that many of the journalists who are already jailed wrongly, who should not be jailed around the world, have been in deeply unsafe conditions. And the very limited safeguards which do exist have been far more limited during this period. And of course, the mitigating measures like having telephone calls with family members or being able to see their lawyers in some limited way have been very restricted. And that's been a particular problem for many of my clients, including, for example, in Pakistan and in Egypt. That other aspect, I think, is sometimes forgotten. So it's not just about the laws, the emergency laws brought in using the guise of a response to COVID-19. It's also the practical ramifications for those who are already being targeted and who are more easily targeted and who have fewer safeguards available to them during lockdown.
Maria, we've got about 5 minutes left. I actually want to ask both of you a bit about what's happening in Hong Kong, but first of all, I mean, you're an American citizen, Maria. I mean, a lot of people facing a 6-year jail term would get on that plane and never come back. Have you ever thought about it? I mean, you wouldn't be the first dissident, somebody perceived as an opposition figure who's facing a jail sentence to leave the countries. But I never got the impression that was in your mind. But I mean, these mornings and you're waking up with this hanging over you, I mean, do you ever consider it or not?
Eric, I'm not alone. I have a company of really smart, idealistic, great journalists, right? And that's one. And then two, look, the baton was passed to me at this moment in time when it matters. And I feel like I've gone to the gym my entire career. I'm ready to go against it. And I think, look, if Filipinos decide that we don't want our democracy, who am I to say, right? But as long as the Constitution is in place, what I want to do is to make sure that I don't voluntarily give up my rights, because I am a Filipino citizen. And that means Judge Montesa signed a verdict, right? We have given it back to her with the 13 things. Like, one of the things that's very strongly worded in that is that I felt there was malice in what the judge wrote, because she even wrote something about how my title as executive editor was, and this is her words, a clever ruse. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's very bizarre. So anyway, there's that, right? I want every step of our descent to dictatorship. I don't know what to call it, but every step of our pullback from democracy, every step when our Constitution is violated, I would love every step to have a signature, because in the end, that's how we protect our rights. I'm willing to stand up for the mission of journalism, for what we do, and I must, because I've got a whole team that's doing their best to hold power to account.
Caoilfhionn, do you ever recommend to your clients that they just get a one-way ticket and leave the country?
So, yeah, I mean, of course, many of my clients who are in a situation like Maria are in exile, so they're not back in their home countries because they can't safely return. So it's fair to say for Amal and myself and Jan and Claire, the situation with Maria is very unusual, because she knows the risks and she returns because she's patriotic, and she feels that the message that would be sent if she were to come out of the Philippines would in itself then have a chilling effect on other journalists. It would be sending a message to all of those brilliant young reporters at Rappler: Maria's not safe, neither are you. So it's an incredibly brave and selfless thing for Maria to do. She knows my views. But yeah, that's obviously a view that she's taken. And it's one of the reasons why she's so astonishing. And you mentioned earlier, Eric, the Time magazine cover in 2018, The Guardians of the War on Truth. And of course, that was the 4 alternative covers, all honoring journalists. And you'll remember that the other 3, there were the Reuters journalists then imprisoned in Myanmar for doing their jobs. There was Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post reporter, in exile from Saudi Arabia, brutally assassinated for doing his job. And there was the Capital Maryland newspaper, the victims of the mass shooting by a disgruntled man outraged by their reporting. And Maria said to me at one point last year that she looked at those 4 covers and she suddenly realized she was the only one not in prison or dead. And the reality is that they are some of the risks she faces, imprisonment or death, and that there's no sugarcoating it, but she still holds the line. She does her job and she chooses not to be in exile. And she's a remarkable person. You asked me earlier about how the case came to us, and I'm afraid when faced with Maria asking us if we would act for her, there was only one possible answer.
Thank you. So, Maria, we're usually living in this kind of free press kind of haven of Hong Kong, but as you know, there's a new law now which has raised a lot of questions of the limits for journalists. How's it perceived? I mean, with looking at it from the Philippines, particularly with your vast experience in press freedom, how's it viewed from the Philippines? How's it going down with you and colleagues who are also defenders of press freedom? What's the feeling?
Shock.
Shock.
Yeah, because look, when we were looking at the protests, this surge for press freedom, and I understood why, and we all were kind of trying to understand, why isn't that happening here? What's the difference? And I think that, what we're seeing is really a geopolitical power shift, and COVID-19 is helping that. But this is also where I feel Hong Kong is punching above its weight. What you guys do will impact the rest of us. And the Philippines is also punching above its weight in terms of the geopolitical power balance, because President Duterte's shift from the US to China and Russia, he said this in October of 2016 in Beijing, that is shifting the power balance in the South China Sea, what we call the West Philippine Sea, and everything else. So having said that, that's a long roundabout way of, what are we seeing? Are we really seeing, I became a journalist when people power, that was my first year as a reporter in 1986, when people power sparked all these movements for democracy all around the world. And then now to kind of see this going through Southeast Asia and then now Hong Kong, I knock on wood. I worry about democracy. Are we headed back to tyranny? How do we fight this? How do we create the world we want to live in?
Caoilfhionn, have you read the new national security law?
I have.
What's your view of it?
Yeah, shock and concern is a reaction that I would have too. I mean, seems to me, and I saw what Carrie Lam said on Tuesday when asked by a reporter if she would guarantee that journalists in the city would be free to report with the new law in place. And I understand that the response was, if all reporters in Hong Kong can give me a 100% guarantee that they will not commit any offences under this piece of national legislation, then I can do the same. And I mean, that's a promise which isn't worth the paper it's not written on, if I can put it that way. When you then look at the law, which is breathtakingly broad. I read with some horror the description of the crime of subversion, undermining the power or authority of central government. So the crimes themselves are exceptionally broad. The sentences, crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, collusion with foreign forces punishable by a maximum sentence of life in prison, power to fine media companies, for example. You then have something which I think has been overlooked in some of the international coverage. I'm very concerned by the provisions relating to regulation and surveillance. I mean, the power that someone suspected of breaking this breathtakingly broad law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance is of serious concern to journalists, and also the extraterritorial nature. There is a real question about what's going to happen in relation to the extraterritorial nature. But I suppose something which I'm not as across as I should be, but also very much concerns me is the power to send some cases to be tried in mainland China, and whether there may be any importation of judges from mainland China in relation to these cases. So, I mean, that's a whistle-stop tour. I'm afraid I read it and took a red pen to almost every single paragraph. And I know that many broadcasters and media organizations who have operations in Hong Kong are obviously deeply concerned, but so are many who report on and about Hong Kong without a geographical presence because of that extraterritorial nature of the provisions.
So, Maria, I'd like to ask you one final question before we finish. Coming back to Hong Kong, you know, the whole particularly young generation of journalists in Hong Kong who've been used to the freedoms of Hong Kong, who've grown up with it and covered the protests. And there's definitely been a chilling effect. People are deleting social media accounts, asking, that question that Caoilfhionn referred to was Tom Grundy from the Hong Kong Free Press. You know, what are the limits? Because the red lines move, as we know. So, Maria, what advice would you give to journalists, and particularly young generation journalists, in this new reality, new environment in Hong Kong, facing this? Someone who's been in very tough situations. How do they adjust to this? How should they hold the line as journalists? How do they not give in to fear? How do you push the limits? What would you just say? I mean, how do you just keep doing your job, basically? What advice would you give them?
It's so tough, but you know, we watch what is happening in Hong Kong, and the way, even using the blank sheets of paper, right? The way folks are pushing back. So I think the first is to think that what you do matters, right? Not to give it up voluntarily. That every little thing you do matters, because you will create this. You will accept it or you will push back. Whatever that thing is, what you do matters right now. So this time period is incredibly important. The second thing is technology, which I think you know this better than I do, right? Like, again, what we're seeing globally is really the impact of technology in terms of surveillance, in terms of actually, as you said, taking down all of the things. How do we, is this one of those moments? How do we, China is actually leading this in terms of creating the credit system, the social credit system, right? The kind of surveillance that we've never seen before, that is now going to be turned against its citizens. This is the fear of contact tracing, of what COVID-19 will allow. What will data do? I think that's the second part, is we have to understand the technology. We have to understand how we make technology our partners in protecting ourselves and democracy, not succumb to it.
Final word, Caoilfhionn. Caoilfhionn, would you like to say, just to finish up? How do you see the future? Are you optimistic or not?
Well, I mean, look, the thing is, we are obviously dealing with a system where we've given Maria the best possible fighting chance of succeeding in this appeal. Critically, though, it's not just about that case. Maria is due to be arraigned later this month on another case, another one of the many cases ranged against her. And the second of the cyber libel cases brought by Kang is also proceeding. So you've got to remember that she's actually facing this very wide range of threats. Mm-hmm. And Rappler had its operating license removed, so it could go dark at any time. And it's absolutely critical that all of us who are here, who are joining here, make clear that the world is watching Duterte, the world is watching this administration, and we've got to help Maria to hold the line.
Thank you. So, Maria, Caoilfhionn, thank you again. And for everybody who's watching, we'll be posting this online tomorrow with a story, and we'll talk soon, and stay safe. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.